Hi, this is your host, Joe Rebelo, and welcome to Martial Arts Today Television. In this month's episode, we'll be featuring a very special guest all the way from Washington State, a gentleman who I've wanted to meet for many years in relationship to the art of Ed Parker's American Kempo, Mr. A.c Rainey. Mr. Rainey, first of all,
sir,
it's a pleasure making your acquaintance and finally getting to meet you after all these many years.
My pleasure as well.
And thank you for visiting our television program. Now, the first question I always ask my interviewees is, how did you begin in the martial arts?
You would have to ask that question. In a very short word, Dave Hebler and Paul Dye. They were at this college that I was at. They had a school, Dave had a school called Tiger and Dragon Kempo. I had just got finished playing football and wrestling, and sitting there in the stands. And to make a long story short, they challenged me to come down and partake in the demo that they were doing, which was freestyle. Well, I went down and did my thing, and I ended up winning what they called a match at that particular point. And at that next minute, Dave invited me down to the school, and the rest is history. He introduced me to a guy by the name of Jim Thompson. Jim took over my tutelage. Ended up moving in with Paul and Patty Dye. And if it hadn't been for those four, I probably wouldn't have ever gotten into Kenpo.
Wow. Now we should mention, again, because I know when most people say, you know, a challenge match and whatnot, you had already had some Kenpo training in the past, and of course your wrestling experience as well. And for our general public, again, one of the names you may recognize, of course, is Dave Hebler. Dave Hebler, to many, was one of the Memphis Mafia, which was the term that was used for Elvis Presley's bodyguards back in the 1970s. And of course, for those familiar with the American Kempo community, Paul Dye, who is a well-known high-ranking black belt, who is very prolific in the West Coast and also internationally as well. And now, what was the training like? And of course, I can't forget to mention Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson, I had the pleasure of meeting back in 1985. Some people know him not only for his Kenpo training, but also being the instructor of several members of the band Alabama. And very fortunate that he was one of the rough and tumble, as well as Mr. Hebler and Mr. Dye,
yes.
Rough and tumble Kenpo practitioners, as it were. So tell me, what was the training like back then? I mean, again, that's a pretty impressive group to be around on a regular basis.
Fun, lots of fun. Kenpo 24/7, literally 24/7. And when I say that, my first month, the very first month, I ended up moving out of my parents' house. I was, as I said, was in college. We would train. I'd go to practice, like for example, on a Saturday morning, about 3 hours, 4 hours, and then after the 4 hours on a Monday. Well, after the first initial month, let's just put it this way: after the first initial month, which was those 4 hours, etc., I moved in with Paul and Patty, and I ended up becoming a instructor underneath Dave at that particular point. That was after 2-3 months, period. And our training was literally night and day, because at 10 o'clock in the morning, we go to the school, we finish up around 8 o'clock, maybe 9 o'clock at night. Then we'd go home, we might grab a burger at In-N-Out or something of that nature. That was Paul's favorite. We'd go back home. Paul would jump on the guitar or something of that nature, grab the drums. We had a room in the back of the house. We'd jump on that for about an hour. That'd calm us down, and then we'd go back out in the living room and we'd study and work until about 4 o'clock in the morning, literally.
Wow.
And Paul and I did that for about 2 years, all the way through our black belts.
Wow. Now we should explain again. At the time, with the instructors program, you were actually teaching, if I'm not mistaken, as you were going through the instructors program. You literally were one rank above whatever students that you were instructing at that time.
For the most part, yeah, absolutely. Right up until around green belt, when we were already up above a lot of people at that point, we had to stay up. It was very demanding, and it was a great challenge in the idea that, you know what, you got to get good. You got to get good. That was the whole idea. And with Paul and I pushing each other, it was fairly easy to just keep on going. And then we also had another individual in the group. He didn't live at the house, but we had another guy that lived at the house by the name of Ken Barada. He was also Ned Parker Kenpo black belt. And there are other names such as Barry Elwood.
Oh, Barry Elwood,
yes.
right. Barry Elwood.
Barry was at the school, and a couple of other people, and it was quite a time. Ruth Ann and Casilda and all those guys, Larry Fry. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. Sometimes we got hurt. No, we got hurt a lot. I mean, Jim Thompson really pushed it, and I can remember walking out and bleeding and stuff at the night. And not that I don't love him, I do. If it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have ever developed the hard nails and stuff of that nature. But it was fun. It was a whole lot of fun.
You know, we should talk about, again, we talk about Jim Thompson, and, you know, there's a phrase that we use occasionally in Kempo, and every martial art. We have certain people who are the animals. And the animals were the people that you kept on a short leash and fed them raw meat, and you sicked them on people.
I happen to be the raw meat.
And like I said, he has to be the raw meat sometimes. You betcha. And you know, and these were the guys who were more than happy to demonstrate, you know, how Kempo worked and how effectively it worked. And you know, the classic phrase Mr. Parker would always say: "To hear is to doubt, to see is to be deceived, to feel is to believe." And believe me, when you felt, you believed.
We heard that a lot. We heard that quite often. Quite often.
Now, you know, in relationship to your Kempo training, there's also another prolific group that you were involved in, and that was the BKF, the Black Karate Federation, which was founded by then Steve Sanders, later to be Steve Muhammad, and how you met another gentleman who's well known in the Kempo community, Ron Chappelle. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, as you know, we were before I even thought about fighting or any of that stuff, Dave had mentioned the fact that perhaps you should start participating in tournaments. And that was because at that particular point, I was getting fairly skillful. As I said, the first fight was my opening salvo of learning how to fight. There was a particular group that was very, very good at fighting. That was the BKF. BKF I would often watch, and because I was Ed Parker Kempo derivative, they always kind of like made fun. You know what I'm saying? Because 9 times out of 10, our skills weren't as good as I thought back then as their skills. They hit you and they just keep hitting and boom, quick, fast, and the whole 9 yards. Well, there was a particular, at one of Mike Stone's tournament, the Four
Seasons,
right,
yes.
I ended up losing that particular match. An individual came over, and his name was Ron Chappelle at the time. I didn't know who he was, but he was always watching. Him and Bob Wright were always in the background. You always knew who those guys were. I didn't know who he was at that time. I knew who Steve was, but I didn't know him. I knew who Donnie was. I didn't know him. And he walked up to me and says, you know, if you want to learn how to fight, you should actually come see me. I thought to myself, huh? And he goes, yeah. And then he started describing some of the action, you know, the initial movement and the stuff that we use in Kempo. And he was describing everything, the little nuances that I was missing. For example, I was wasting a lot of motion. I was doing too much with my hands. I wasn't closing ground fast. He literally sat me down, and we would sit just like you and I are sitting right here. We'd go to his house or go over to the school. The school was at Manual Arts High School. And that's where our contingent of BKF. Now, I didn't go to the other areas. I was always underneath him. And I need to make that clear because most of the time, guys like Russell and all those guys, I never ended up going to those schools, but it was underneath Ron. I got my butt kicked on my first match by a girl by the name of Yolanda Mason.
Yolanda Mason.
After that, I started learning how to fight a lot better, a lot more efficient. And between her and a guy by the name of Shane, Shane actually was my running mate for while I was there because it was him I would go over. I should also mention that Ruth Ann also went with me, one of Dave's other people. And she was quite a good fighter. We had 2 women that were very good at at Dave's school, Ruth Ann and Cassetto Roman. To make a long story short, in the less time from, I would say, green, blue belt, all the way up through brown belt, I became a very, very efficient fighter underneath that. And between, if it hadn't been for Dave allowing that to happen, for me to go back and forth between the schools, as a matter of fact, he encouraged it, as well as Mr. Parker. They both encouraged it. I probably wouldn't have been a very good fighter. That's where I learned how to fight, as far as the fighting is concerned.
Excellent.
It's a long story.
Well, for our viewers, the Black Karate Federation, again, it was one of the premier, and still is one of the premier fighting groups in relationship to the Kempo community. Again, founded by Steve Sanders, again, now Steve Mohammed, and featuring such luminaries as, even though not for a Kempo background per se, Donnie Williams,
there you go.
Pace, Madman Leon Russell, I mean, not Leon, right? With Madman Russell?
He didn't start. He was in it, that's for sure. And a couple other people.
And of course, later on, Orned Gabriel, Chicken Gabriel,
there
and
you
other
go.
individuals from that lineage. They were really the people that were really the movers and shakers. They were really the top fighters of the day. Another guy, Jerry Smith, that comes to mind. Again, these were the people that were.
Jerry Smith was very much
was created at that time because a lot of African Americans did not feel that in the tournament circuit in California that they were getting a fair shake, and also really the camaraderie amongst each other as African Americans working to work on the particular slant of Kempo. That's, again, then Steve Sanders, now Steve Mohammed, was advocating. And they were the fighters of the day. They were, you knew when you were going to fight somebody from BKF, you were in for a fight. And we mentioned about Yolanda Mason. Losing to Yolanda Mason is no discrepancy in your career at all. We talked previously about the wars between Yolanda Mason and Mary Stark Owens from Kaju Kempo. I'm sorry, those weren't fights. They were wars. And to this day, they're still talked of in that mode. Really, the quality and the dynamic, explosive attitude of the BKF fighters is something that will stand the test of time in the annals of American martial arts history. It's that simple. Now, and of course, I got to mention Ron Chappelle. Ron Chappelle again is Dr. Chappelle. Who is now very prolific in the formulation of sub-level 4 Kenpo.
That's correct.
Which is a sub-level of the 4th level of Kenpo in relation to contact. No contact, superficial contact, contact penetration, and contact manipulation. And that 4th level, and utilizing the sub-level of that 4th level of Kenpo in relationship to his particular version of Mr. Parker's system. That's the key.
That's good. That's good. That's wonderful.
I hope I got that. I passed the audition. Yeah. Now, another one thing you're very well known for in the Kempo community is your involvement in law enforcement. Now, how did you get involved in law enforcement?
Oh, great. That is a sad story. Back in the day, I am not sure how to tell this story. Back in the day, we had, well, I'll just put it this way, and I'm going to leave the other stuff out.
Sure.
I was walking down the street one day, and it's going to the job around 6 o'clock in the morning in Pomona, California. And in that particular day, going down, I believe it was Mission Street or Missionary, the cops stopped me. And they stopped me literally for, at that point, what I thought was just walking down the street. One of the guys pointed a gun at me. Actually, several of them pointed guns at me, and I actually was in a very fear of my life at that particular point. Now you have to understand, this was a little bit after I had already studied Kempo, and at the same time I had studied Kempo, and at the same time I was just starting my first job. Okay, my job was an ice cream driver. Now, I don't want everybody to take anything away from that, because I like ice cream. Right. But the whole idea was to go to my first job and be good at it. Anyway, make a long story short, I found out later, after they let me up off the ground in the whole 9 yards, that some woman had her kids kidnapped. Well, I being of African descent and the whole 9 yards, I thought they were picking on me for that particular reason. Well, obviously they were, because the child was taken by an African American at that particular point. To make a long story short, I thought to myself, you know what, I understand her dilemma. I also understand that at that particular point, there was a better way of stopping somebody, and in that particular case, not making them feel that abuse, and because it was fairly obvious I didn't have a gun, I didn't have a weapon, or any of the other stuff. And so I thought, if I'm going to give back to my community, what better way than to become a cop? There was other things that had occurred. For example, I had seen a child get shot, literally, for stealing a spark plug. And he hadn't even stolen a spark plug. He wasn't even out the store or anything of that nature. And yet the accusation was there. And so, you know, between growing up and some of the other stuff that you see around the neighborhood or neighborhoods, it made you want to do something else, something more, something that was bigger than you. And being a cop, being a law enforcement, being in police work was how I thought I could do it.
Excellent. That's fantastic. You know, again, now you've had a lot of, now it's a very interesting perspective being a law enforcement officer, an LEO, in regards to having an art which is very dynamic and very explosive. And I decoratively call Kempo many times how to rip, gouge, maim, and mutilate for fun and profit. Okay? Which isn't far too off the beaten path when you really think about the term. But taking that type of art and then having to apply your martial arts in relationship to the law enforcement field, which obviously does not advocate that particular realm of vernacular and technique, how did you find having to apply what you did in relationship to your law enforcement activities?
It was very applicable, literally applicable. I can remember on the first time I had my first bus, I was literally fighting for my life. If it hadn't been for Kenpo, I would be a dead man right now.
Wow.
And I shouldn't say it that way. I should say in the aspect that I had to deal with a drunk who was a higher rank in the whole 9 yards, who literally tried to take my head off. That I dealt with that. I've dealt with it in the aspect that I've taken down bank robbers in the whole 9 yards, or in liquor store robbers. One of my injuries occurred because of that. But had it not been for Kenpo, literally, with all the skills, I'd probably not be here, sitting here talking with you right now. And that was back in the past, and as a young man. Right. And I do have to say, it does not relieve you from being scared. At least back in those days.
There you go. You know, and I think that's a very important aspect of it. You know, I mean, we look at not only the physicality, but the mindset and the training. You know, there's a classic phrase I always say. You know, I've been fortunate or unfortunate to be in different confrontations with lethal force and different things where I've had to deal with people basically trying to end my life. And I've always had a very important phrase that I'll never forget, and every time I've had to deal with a real life encounter. I get hit harder in class. You know, I mean, we laugh about that, but we know that. We sit there and say, bang, and it's like, who lied to you and told you you know how to hit? You know, I'll tell you how people hit somebody. Let me show you how someone hits somebody. And you see that reality in that. And being in an art like Kenpo, I mean, you know, you get slammed. Yes. And you know, like I said, to feel is to believe. And when you deal with a real life confrontation, a lot of times people who don't know how to hit or think they know how to hit, and you get struck by someone, and you're like going, "No, I've been hit harder in class." And it's a reality, and just dealing with that and defending yourself in those situations. Now, again, since this time, again, you've been into martial arts many years.
Yes.
And again, you've had a lot of on-the-job experience in relationship to your law enforcement field.
Yes.
I consider that an accurate term to use. You know, yeah. You know. Again, you've been featured in different martial arts publications and mentioned, and of course, one of the people who have really assisted with that is one of your students, Mr. Rich Hale.
Ah, Mr. Hale, yes.
How did you meet Rich Hale?
Now you're aware that I've seen your show, so I know that this story is out there all over the place.
It's out there, but I'd like to get your viewpoint on it.
I don't tell this story as well as Rich.
Oh, don't.
Because there's some details I may have forgotten, and Rich knows that I'm a little bit younger than him, but I've been hit a few more times. So here's the key. I met Rich in probably around 81. I'm not quite sure the year. It was 81, 82, somewhere in there. I met him in Alaska. I been shipped up to Alaska, and I was in the Air Force. I taught with them. And I was looking for a Kenpo school. I was actually looking for some place to study, to be honest. And I'd gone to a guy by the name of Tanaka, and I told him I would be back. Well, I never went back because in the interim I had gone across town and found this Kenpo school that said Kenpo. I said, no way, there's a Kenpo school here. Okay, great. So I walked in the door and I was met by Mr. Hill, and he had a couple other students in there and the whole 9 yards. He told me at that point that he was teaching Kenpo, and because I'd asked if that's what it was, whether it was Mr. Parker's Kenpo. And he asked me who I was and why it was that I was interested in stuff. And one thing led to another, and I'm telling him, yes, I'm an Ed Parker Kenpo black belt. He tells me to come into the office. I says, okay, yeah, I can do that. So I figure we're just gonna go in there and talk.
Right.
He starts picking up the phone and makes a phone call. And I'm saying, okay, you shouldn't be doing that. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a little off-put, because here you are, and like this, and just like this, and he's making a phone call, and Mr. Parker, and he goes, literally, he says, Mr. Parker. I says, what? Are you kidding me?
Call Ed Parker on me?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he really did. And this is.
Did you call my dad on me? What's up with that?
Yeah. And yeah, here I am. You know, here's the part that was hard. I didn't know what Mr. Parker was going to really say to me, because I hadn't talked to Mr. Parker in about 1.5 years. Okay, it had been that long. I'd been in the service. You don't call Dad and say, well, can you help me out or anything like that. So he goes, this is Mr. Parker, and something he said on the one line, he goes, just like that, gave me the phone. I'm just as nervous as, anyway, that's the bottom line. That's how I met Rich Hill.
Wow.
After all that, after the meeting and the talking with Mr. Parker and the whole 9 yards, you know, guess what? We became friends. We started. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't quite sure if I liked him, to be honest with you, at that point. Okay, but he invited me to come back and told me that I was to be the instructor, or not instructor, but to start teaching. I had told him I could help out and all that stuff. And when I say not liking him, I'm telling you in this aspect, he was kind of a runt as far as I was concerned, but because I'd already been around Kenpo for a while. But guess what? I liked him. He was very, very strong punches, strong kicks. Didn't back off. I enjoyed him. I really enjoyed him. And it was just a little bit after that meeting, the next 3 meetings, we got to become really, really close friends. Between him and some of the other gang up there, and I say that, I talked about Larry Carmichael, Art Copeland, Schroeder, and on and on. I could keep on going. We developed quite the culture of Kenpo up in Alaska, and you have to understand, if it hadn't been for Rich Hill, Kenpo wouldn't have ever existed up in Alaska at the scale that it is now. So.
Excellent. That, you know, that's a fantastic story. You know, my favorite, you mentioned about that incident, and you know, my favorite line from Rich Hill is, you know, you sit there and say, so who's the instructor here? And he goes, you are.
Yeah. Well.
Excuse me.
Yeah, those are, again, details I kind of forget, and when I hear him talk about it, I have to talk. I remember it now, and I can't really come out and say it the way he says it, but I'll be honest with you. As far as I was concerned, he taught me more than what I taught him, because anytime you learn to teach, and it's all about teaching, you're learning more.
Oh,
and Rich had actually got to teach me. He doesn't understand that, so. And I say that from a teacher-student relationship, but also from a friendship relationship.
Excellent. Well, our final question for today's interview, obviously, is what does the future hold for you in relationship to the martial arts?
I'm a Kenpoist. I'm going to be teaching Kenpo for the rest of my life. I've committed the rest of my life to Kenpo. My job is to go out and help spread Kenpo in a way that Kenpo is understood for its vast array of motion, its principles, more importantly, to spread Mr. Parker's principles, because this is what most people don't understand. A lot of this isn't about me or anything else. It's about how I got to learn the Kenpo through Mr. Parker and his principles. And a lot of times what we fail to forget is if it hadn't been for those principles or any of that stuff, there's no way I could have ever accomplished anything in Kenpo. You know, when you're off by yourself and all you have is that book, those manuals, and yet you can call and pick up the phone, you talk to Mr. Parker, or you have people around who understand the principles and they're spreading it to you, and then you're starting to interact with those principles and you're teaching those principles and you start understanding it, then you gain a new insight, and the insight is this. Guess what, Mr. Parker? You were absolutely right on a lot of things, and I got to grow into it in a way that wasn't necessarily there for each and every class, but in the beginning I was there when he was at classes, went on Friday nights and the whole 9 yards. So I'd like to give some of that back, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to continue on giving it back, and it's not, when we say giving it back, I don't mean necessarily to the world, but the Kenpo community, and it's the Kenpo community that we literally are part of all the time, and they're the ones that get to spread the art. So that's my job.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to do this. I know that not only myself, but so many people who appreciate this wonderful interview. And we're going to be back with some exciting action here on Martial Arts Today Television. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we had talked about Mr. Hill. This is Mr. Rich Hill right here, my good friend. Okay? All right, so what we're going to do is a technique called sleeper. And sleeper is for right-hand punch. The thing I like about sleeper, though, is that this is a technique that a lot of the motion, or some of the motion in sleepers, motion that we had to use on the street. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is I'll probably do a technique called sleeper. A lot of times sleeper for me is a very reminiscent technique, because for the most part this is one of the techniques that I actually had to use more often than I wanted to. But here's the thing, it's not about the techniques, and I'm not going to even think about the techniques. I will do the technique, but I'm going to show you the motions that I had to use a lot of times on the street. So we'll start it off, sleeper, we'll start it off with the basic technique. And the basic technique goes like this. We step in, we create a block. We work from this, we bring that hand straight up in here. We can lock up either here or here. And we'll usually take this leg, we'll switch up. After we create a choke, we'll take that leg from up under here, we'll check down, and we'll punch down. Now here's the thing. A lot of times I didn't use a whole lot of things, such as a bad thing about doing this. That's fine, but that would probably not get me too many. I'd be in the back office, and I didn't like being in the admin office. So in order to do the motion, a lot of times I would punch. Make this an easier motion so he never saw, and this would come back up. Now what you're not seeing is there's an incidental motion that happens to be occurring on the back side, and this is stuff that Mr. Hebler would teach all the time. And my hand would come down and check at that shoulder, literally hurting them. That would take a lot of the fight out. Then I would actually, and this is on a 400-pound or 300-pound man, I'd go up and top, and I'd actually start to work into this part. When you feel this, just tap. Good. And I drop back in, take that leg out, check down, up, and then punch into the head. Again, I didn't do that, okay? I just want you to understand that. So, that's right here. Okay. If we were really doing the technique a little bit faster, you okay? All right. Let's do another Kenpo favorite. Nice technique called 5 swords. Thing I like about 5 swords, most of the time I don't like to broadcast my actions. So the first movement, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and he's still standing. He's not supposed to be standing.
I'm new.
That's okay. A little bit faster.
Okay. That's it.